Do you not find that naturalism is a sort of a bent, an angle that you're coming at, and that you allow nothing in that realm, but that you're so shut off from the beginning, nothing could ever meets the evidence?
There would be no problem for me to be persuaded out of naturalism. It's a matter of what is the model that best fits the data. Again, it is not an assumption. Some people try to sometimes say that science or naturalists start from an assumption of naturalism, so they just simply won't consider alternatives. I'm very happy to consider alternatives. I think that there were some phenomena in the world which really looked exactly like some religious tradition was saying should happen and was miraculous, was seemingly violating the laws of physics. What would scientists do in that situation? They would not say, oh, we're not allowed to think about this because we agreed yesterday at faculty tea that the world was a natural world. I think they would try to come up with the best explanation. If the best explanation is not naturalism, then I would buy that. I will say that naturalism seems to me to be a priori simpler than theism, because naturalism has the natural world, theism has the natural world and something else that I think is ill-defined. But I didn't actually use that. I think in a proper quantitative Bayesian probability analysis, my prior for naturalism is higher than my prior for theism, but overwhelming evidence will always take care of that. I just don't think it's there. If theism were really true, there's no reason for God to be hard to find. He should be perfectly obvious, whereas in naturalism, you might expect people believe in God, but the evidence to be thin on the ground. Under theism, you'd expect that religious beliefs should be universal. There's no reason for God to give special messages to this or that primitive tribe thousands of years ago. Why not give it to anyone? Whereas under naturalism, you'd expect different religious beliefs inconsistent with each other to grow up under different local conditions. Under theism, you'd expect religious doctrines to last a long time in a stable way. Under naturalism, you'd expect them to adapt to social conditions. Under theism, you'd expect the moral teachings of religion to be transcendent, progressive, sexism is wrong, slavery is wrong. Under naturalism, you'd expect that they reflect, once again, local mores, sometimes good rules, sometimes not so good. You'd expect the sacred texts under theism to give us interesting information. Tell us about the germ theory of disease. Tell us to wash our hands before we have dinner. Under naturalism, you'd expect that sacred text to be a mishmash, some really good parts, some poetic parts, and some boring parts and mythological parts. Under theism, you'd expect biological forms to be designed. Under naturalism, they would derive from the twists and turns of evolutionary history. Under theism, minds should be independent of bodies. Under naturalism, your personality should change if you're injured, tired, or you haven't had your cup of coffee yet. Under theism, you'd expect that maybe you can explain the problem of evil. God wants us to have free will, but there shouldn't be random suffering in the universe. Life should be essentially just. And at the end of the day, in theism, you basically expect the universe to be perfect. Under naturalism, it should be kind of a mess. This is very strong empirical evidence.
It is absolutely true that science in the Western world owes its existence to the church. Historically, big deal. It's a historical fact. First of all, the church was the only seat of power and money, and therefore education, from medieval times, even before medieval times onward. So it was if you wanted to study science, you had to go to a university which had to be supported by the church because it was the only seat of power and money. So the fact that there's this early connection between the origins of science and religion is historical, interesting, but doesn't say anything about science. Moreover, the wonderful thing about children is they grow up. So the church is the mother of science. But the great thing about children is they grow up, and the even better thing for some children is they leave home. Parents here who are in that situation parents here who aren't in that situation will bemoan the fact that some children don't leave home. But science originated in the only form of education there was, but it grew up. And then the questions that science asked progressed. The questions that religion asked didn't progress. Because the difference between science and religion is that we don't assume the answers before we ask the questions. We let nature tell us the answers. Science doesn't make universal claims. Science constantly changes, which is the great thing about science. As I often say as a theoretical physicist, that the two best states to be in are wrong and confused, because those mean there's something to learn. So science, by definition, evolves and changes in the face of evidence. The fact is that science is done by scientists, and scientists are human. But the scientific enterprise progresses because it does not rely on human intuition, human desire, human weakness. It relies on what works, and what works survives, and what doesn't work goes out like yesterday's newspaper. It's just the way. That's what's so wonderful about it. The reason we train students in science and force them to do these incredibly boring problems that turn most people off science is to try and build up some intuition so that later on your intuition may be reliable. So that's the first thing. But the most important part of science is that we also don't trust scientific intuition. Absolutely, we try and develop scientific intuition, which often means overcoming normal intuition, because our myopic view of reality is usually wrong. But we distrust it, and that's the real key. We distrust it because we say, okay, prove it. In fact, prove it wrong. And prove it, and as Feynman said, scientists not only try and prove themselves right when they have a good idea based on intuition, the good scientists try and prove themselves wrong. And that's the hardest part of science.
Notice that Andy has not offered us any evidence for his God tonight, for his hypothesis. All he is arguing for is our ignorance of the answer to certain scientific questions. That's not arguing for a God, that's arguing for ignorance. And then, oh, here's a gap, let's plug it with something. And maybe the God of the Bible kind of fits that, maybe. That's not an argument for a God. That's not evidence at all. There is evidence that we have some unanswered questions. We all admit that. I agree, there is plenty of evidence that there are some questions in science we don't have a clue about. Every scientist will tell you that. Well, that's what drives science. That's what makes science exciting.
Science is a process. We all can do it or not do it. I refuse to accept a dichotomy between scientists. All of us do science from the time we're children. That's how we learn. Kids put their hands in flames and discover it's hot. That's what makes us grow up and learn how to deal with the world. And one of the things I fight the most is the notion that somehow science should be the domain of scientists. The scientific process should be applied broadly to our public policy and the way we live, because it's useful and it works and it enhances our lives. But it's not the domain of a small group of people with hoods.
So unlike God, who is an artist and can't be predicted, nature is not an artist. Nature plays by the rules. Nature makes predictions. Nature provides explanations. Thank you.
Just like science and politics are intertwined, so is religion and politics. So to answer where is religion heading is to answer where is the world heading. I don't see a future where religion can be separated from culture, science, politics, power plays, everything. If I wanted to believe something, it would be that religion is heading towards where it gives less and less room for fundamentalist violence, oppression. I think that if we were to look at history and draw out the line, we would see that religion has moved in that direction, and hopefully it will continue to do so. But again, everything else will determine that also.